welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat Series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I am Rebecca Kalogeris for Pragmatic Institute, your host for this episode. The power of customer experience, right? That's something that we talk about in different ways all the time. It is something we think about from the pre-purchase process all the way to how they interact with our products. And today I really want to talk about that sort of customer experience design and the role of both data and creativity in that effort. So in order to have that conversation, we had to bring in someone who's an expert in that area, and that is what we've done. So I am thrilled to have Cairo Kenan Marsh, the founder and executive partner of Relativ, on the show. Cairo is an entrepreneur, a marketing expert who is passionate about helping businesses win by better serving their audience. His company, Relativ, does this through relationship-driven customer experience strategies and innovative marketing campaigns. For the past 10 years, they've helped market leaders and challenger brands both in the USA and Asia. So we get a nice global perspective as well. Welcome, Cairo.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And hopefully I can share some thoughts that are of value to you and your audience.
Yes, we're super excited. I always start everybody off with sort of like, what is your origin story, right? How did you get where you are today? And why is this sort of customer experience your passion and your superhero power?
It's my origin story. I've never thought of it that way, but I like that. I like that framing. If I were to say my origin story, if you watch a comic book movie, origin stories always come out of tragedy. Peter Parker loses his uncle or X, Y, and Z. These bad things happen. If I think about my origin story in that sort of comic book narrative, I think it comes out of marketing difficulty, right? And working in contexts where people are not aligned, where people are working against each other, where you see how the lack of relationship thinking, both in how you work internally and how you work for your consumers, really start to negatively impact work. So I was in a situation when I was working at an agency where everything was uber transactional in terms of how we dealt with ourselves, uber transactional, I think, of how we dealt with the client's needs, uber transactional, how the client was looking at their consumer needs. And coming out of that, honestly, to a certain degree, is a bit traumatized. This is just not working. It's not healthy. And that really formed the genesis for the idea of the company Relativ, which is really looking at experiences through the lens of relationships and also building a culture that enables that. So the origin story comes from that, I guess, from that trauma, if you will.
I like that. It's no spider bite, but it works. Yeah. When you think about, that's really interesting to think about, not just experience, right? We think about customer experience, we map the customer experience, we map the customer journey. But I think, and maybe this is why there's a difference in the word journey and experience, because experience has an emotional aspect and it has that relationship piece to it, right? Which is clearly a big sort of backbone of what you do. So let's explore that a little bit more. When you think about how relationships matter with brands or with companies, tell me more about that.
Yeah, and if I could just build on one of the thought that you had around the difference between customer journey and customer experience, it's also, in my opinion, customer journey is a fallacy. Customers aren't on journeys. They're happy doing whatever they're doing, and they're just looking for solutions to whatever their problems are. So they may be on a journey to explore different solutions to whatever their problem is, but they're not really on a customer journey in terms of how they connect with the business or brand. But ultimately, all customers have experiences. It doesn't matter if that's the destination, the plan, the intention. It's when they interact with you, you shape a perception that forms your identity as a company in the consumer's mind or the customer's mind. It forms your how businesses and customers and people that you serve will start to think of you. So experiences drive everything. And I think the connection with relationships is, what are your relationships? What are your experiences for? Are you designing it for a transaction, which is fine? Or are you designing it for customer service, which is fine? There's nothing wrong with any of those. But you can also design it in a way that allows you to better connect, better monetize the relationship you have with that customer, so that it's not just a simple, okay, we got this journey done, we collected this and that journey was successful or not. But really where you're looking at it holistically is how do I move that customer down to a deeper relationship with the product or service or brand that you're putting out there.
Yeah, it's a good point. No one's like, oh, grab my bag, I'm going on a journey to make a purchase, right? But they're, there is a path, but it is a very different piece. Whereas experience is, as you said, very holistic. And the advantage of designing the experience with intent to deepen the relationship, a deeper relationship with a company, a product, a brand, we all know that comes out as economic advantage, right? Like it does. And there's very little ways that you could do that. Very little ways you could mirror that kind of depth without a really strong experience. But when you talk about, look, you can do this kind, or you can really build experiences based on relationships, what are some of the traits? What are some of the things that separate those kind of intentions?
Yeah, I think there's two core aspects that we think about in terms of what drives a relationship between a customer and a brand or service provider. Partly it's what are the tangible benefits that you get? And you could break down those benefits in a lot of different functional ways, whether that's value for money, efficiency, X, Y, and Z, whatever the product is designed to do. There are tangible takeaways that I'm supposed to walk away with in that experience. There's also ways that I feel as I go through that journey. How am I treated? How am I respected? How do I view your consideration for your customers and users? So when we look at the design of a relationship-driven journey, it's by those sort of two dimensions. How are you making the user or customer feel along the way and along specific dimensions? And how are you communicating what they are getting and how they recognize their benefits along the way? And it's triangulating those to make sure that you understand where the gaps are in that current customer's perception. So where, as you said before, whereas you have data that can sort of sustain that, then you can use to say, well, there are particular gaps and things you want to dial up or dial down. But it's really about triangulating against those two pieces. Interesting.
So when there's two things I want to dig in here. But first, just like your company, your Relativ, you get a new customer, you get a new company that you're going to work with. What does that process look like? How do you approach understanding the kind of experience they're building today and help them map that to where they want to go?
So we have a new client. Let me make sure I understand the question correctly. We have a new client. That client says, look, I have a goal of X. These are my target base. How do we start to figure out how they design their experience? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I think it starts with goals and questions. So understanding what the goal are as a business, understanding then what questions either they have or that we have. We really believe that there needs to be a clear problem definition and understanding of the problem drivers. So a lot of times what people start to do is you jump to potential solutions, whether that be technology or things that you can offer. That's good. We really generally prefer not to work that way. It's really, let's make sure that we clearly understand the problem, not just as given by the brand that says, well, we want to grow sales this way with this audience. Okay, that's cool. But why aren't you doing that now? So help us really nail down what that problem is. And then we go, okay, great. Underneath that problem, there may be 5 to 7 different drivers that need to be tackled in order to do that. And once you understand what those problem drivers are, then you can start to design specific solutions against each of those drivers that says, well, here's one way we could tackle this. Here's another way we could tackle this. Here's a touch point in which would be relevant to tackle this other driver. So it's really using that problem and driver sort of framework to define things.
So you've told a bunch of product people to not focus on the solution first, which is 100% what you have to do. Like we teach that too. It's so easy as a bunch of tech people and solution people to go and be like, oh, I'll just build this feature. I'll do this. But if you're not really understanding the problem, then you're just throwing things against the wall. 100%.
Absolutely. What you see in that case is that, okay, great, we build this feature. And after you do that, then you got to go build another one, right? Because you are not sure if it wasn't aligned against the problem, whether it worked or not, Even if it's done something, did it solve the core problem? We're not sure.
Absolutely. So the other thing you talked about is data. And I think one of the things you explore a lot in your work is sort of how data is leveraged and used in defining, in measuring, and evolving customer experiences. So can we dive a little bit into that when you think about, does data help us create these solutions and make them even more personalized?
Yeah, I think in a couple of different ways. One, again, I think in a relationship context, you can define data parameters of relationship health and strength, right? And again, the way that we started to think about that is that through that aperture of what tangible benefits is a consumer or customer receiving or should be receiving, how they feel about that, as well as the way that they start to feel about the product or brand sort of at a emotional level and the way they believe it services them or how it makes them feel. So there's data that's defined literally against those sort of parameters. But you obviously, as you look at any particular solution or touch points, depending how the business or brand is interacting, then you want to measure the efficacy of those because you have a sort of macro view around where you're trying to go and where the consumer is, but then you have the micro view that's really around at this point, at this engagement, at this touch point, where are points of failure that create blockages of how performance is blockages to performance.
Nice. Is there any sort of misconceptions, particularly like in the B2B space, about how data should be used?
I think there's a ton of misconceptions. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a million, and I think two things. The first thing, I truly believe data doesn't answer anything. Data answers nothing, and I think there's a lot of over reliance. Okay, I have this data. What's the answer? Data doesn't have any of the answers. Now, what you need are good questions, which come from the business that says, okay, great. What are we trying to solve? Data gives you, in most cases, hypotheses or directions that then need to be tested in order to validate it, right? So I think the fallacy that you can find answers by mining or collecting data, I think is challenging sometimes because then I know sometimes our clients, or sometimes I've seen in other cases, clients get frustrated because they don't get a literal answer from the data. That is very, very, very rare. The other, I think questionable belief around data is there's over-reliance on tools and techniques, particularly if you're talking about analytics and modeling and things like that, which, again, I'm all for it, but only as it gets applied against the question. I think we go sometimes to solutions and techniques more so than going to, okay, what are we trying to solve? And then breaking down a way of doing that. So data, to me, is a strategic instrument that is only useful once you know the problem, once you have hypotheses and you're willing to apply a rigorous process versus look for an easy answer through data.
I think that's a really good point of view, right? I mean, data is like any other tool. It is powerful in the right hands, in the hands of someone who's an expert, who's really looking at it holistically. You don't have a hammer that automatically builds a house, just like you don't have data that automatically tells you what to do. But it used correctly can really inform the process and provide probably, I would say, earlier feedback and more consistent feedback than we used back 100%. In the day when I was a kid, right? Than we got when we got. And that feedback can be powerful, again, in context of the kind of more holistic understanding.
100%. And I think the issue with, I think because data is complex, we also have this schism that happens, right? Where you have your quantitative team who somehow doesn't speak marketing very well, and you have your business team who sometimes gets overwhelmed, and we're looking for answers, and there's frustration in that process. The guidance I really do advise is really about, if I'm business, focus on questions that need to be answered and hypotheses that you want to test. Your quantitative guys should hopefully give you a roadmap to that, but it's really about the question that drives the business. This thing, data, I think it's really powerful. It can also be really simple if you're laser focused on the problems and the questions.
Yeah, this problem underscoring is I think a really, again, it's sort of fundamental to what Pragmatic teaches. And I think it really does different. There's too often where I look at someone's even website or brand and they're not talking at all about the problems they solve. They are talking about the solutions they provide. And that is the antithesis of you showing empathy, understanding, and building a relationship with me, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. You end up with solutions looking for problems versus
Yes.
problems
Look
that
at
you're
my
trying
great
to, you
tool.
know,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
Yes. So one of the things you emphasize would be the word I'm looking for, not empathize.
I empathize with it as well, I'm sure.
I'm sure. One of the things you emphasize is relationship-driven strategies, right? How does this differ between B2B and B2C?
I don't think it differs in principle at all. B2B, obviously, and B2C sort of operate differently in terms of influencing an organization sometimes versus influencing an individual and how you target people. All of that fundamentally changes in terms of how you engage. But in principle, I think the idea holds true because what you're trying to do, if I'm, let's say I've got a solution for a sales manager and I want them to use my product, maybe to track leads or whatever it's going to be. I'm not sure. But what you're really trying to do is that SaaS provider or whatever, you're really trying to have that sales manager understand why not only does this product solve their problem, but why you as a partner are the right partner. That's inherently, to a certain degree, relationship driven. Why did we design our SaaS platform to do this versus that? Why do we highlight these features versus others? It's because we're here for people like you. And I think finding opportunities to understand where that user is in terms of what they think they need besides the pure technology, but how they do their jobs, what they're looking for, is how you then create a differentiated connection, which allows you then to either upsell or keep them on the platform, or when the platform fails to meet a certain need, that they don't trade you out immediately and they continue to work with you until the new update comes out that does. So I think in a B2B context, and obviously that was just more of a SaaS tech example, but in a B2B context, I think that it's exactly the same principle. The method and the touch points and the number of stakeholders that you influence is obviously different.
It's that last part, I think, that is probably, again, it's the same principle, but it really changes when you think about B2B, is that there are often multiple buyers, right? In that process. It's not just one person. Sales agent A doesn't go out and pick Salesforce and buy it for everybody, right?
Absolutely.
So it's the idea that you have to establish relationships with multiple people that 100%. Feel authentic. I think adds a layer of complexity building on the same concept, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. It's definitely more complex in the way that the engagement needs to be, because those multiple stakeholders, and honestly, what the manager needs is going to use the product is different than what the director is looking for. It's different than what the finance person is looking for, and you've got to manage obviously that range of stakeholders, but you're still trying to understand how they actually connect and feel sense of, well, that's the right thing for us or for me, versus, okay, well, I could use that for now because it's a good price, and then I'll move on in whatever time frame.
So one of the things, I don't think there's anyone listening, hopefully not, who's like, customer experience, I don't care, it doesn't matter, right? But there is sometimes within the organizations we serve a feeling that, yes, it matters, but it doesn't rise to the level of importance or impact to unlock investment, right? Yep, they're like, that 100%. Would be a nice to have. So how do you do that? How do you help clients measure the ROI of these investments, especially the longer sales cycles?
100%. I think fundamentally, it's really interesting. This is just a principle that I have that I think I share this with my clients and in discussions, is that I think, one of the biggest things in the last 5 to 8 years of our industry has been digital transformation, right? And honestly, I put quotation marks around it because I'm not even sure what that is. Digital transformation is, in principle, as I understand it, transforming your organization, not for digital is the enabler, to better serve your customer in a digital age of point of interactions, right? And now, as a business, if I go on a digital transformation journey, the amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of investment I put into that is significant. And I don't think most companies embrace that because they're looking at that either from a pure IT or financial, as well as a touch of marketing sort of perspective. I think if you don't apply experience design and planning experiences in the right way into that same framework, you're missing out. Because you do have to think about how you structure your touch points. You do have to think about longer term value, but you do that already. We do that already within the organization. So it's not a massive delta that I'm asking you to move on. I'm actually asking you to connect the dots between why are you investing in these new platforms. You're not doing it for digital. You're doing it for your customers. And therefore, customer experience is core to making that work, and planning and designing that customer experience is core to your success strategy.
So it's almost a way to help you see the ROI of the investments you are already making because you're kind of bringing them together. That's really interesting.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's the argument of why you should do it in terms of actually measuring and monetizing it. One of the things we really try to do is that you need to track, and I'm speaking of this particularly through the relationship lens, which is the core way that we look at it. As you make improvements in your customer relationships, if you're doing currently right now surveys of people who use your product, and you get feedback, as you make changes in that delta, what we found through analysis that we've done, and we've done this for 7 years, is if your growth in customer relationship outpaces your category, generally your revenue and profit performance will as well. So there is measurable data that says by investing in experiences that boost relationships, you can actually receive a positive return. Now, that again, in a lead cycle, you're not going to see that in the next quarter, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to see that in the next quarter. But if you look at that over the long term, and you're also looking at your investments and experience over the long term, there's absolutely real validated data that says that will come back to you. And I think as a business, you have to be in those spaces. You have to think about the short term, but you have to be building a competitive advantage for the long term.
But I mean, again, those relationships, there's, your customer satisfaction scores, there's retention pieces, all of these things matter. But to your point, it's not, this is why some organizations struggle with the investment. It always feels like important, but it's not the closest to my bottom line. And I'm worried about my numbers right now. But that is, it is a short-sighted point of view that costs you money in the long run. But it is sometimes difficult for them to see that balance and know how to find the right one.
And my only argument is this, right? Is that I think that I wouldn't even call it short-sighted. I think obviously the pressures that businesses are under on a daily basis is tremendous, right? Yeah. So look, the second you start talking long-term and I got to report something in 2 weeks, we're having different conversations here. And that is an issue. And I completely understand that. What I would argue is that you do have to deliver in the next 2 weeks, the next quarter, whatever it is. But how are you taking the investment that you're making in marketing, in digital, in technology, and making sure that it's not only going to last for this quarter? I'm not suggesting that you don't deliver now. I'm suggesting that I want you to deliver right now. I think the way to design experiences should deliver right now, but it should be an investment that also carries over versus just an expenditure.
Right. You're going to make the investment to some degree anyway. I want you to think about it both in terms of short-term game and long-term relationship, right? It's a tweak of point of view more than a secondary swim lane, right?
100%. But it's also not a trade-off. It's not, I'm sacrificing today for tomorrow. Because we can't do that. You cannot sacrifice today for tomorrow,
Yeah. We cannot stop everything right now to make it perfect down the road. They will not keep us employed.
Exactly. But we have to, I think, do things today that set us up also for tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's keeping that balance in all the efforts we do. So, we all hear about how things are evolving. And I would be curious in your point of view of how this sort of relationship experience could potentially be altered sort of with the increasingly AI-powered everything. AI-powered everything.
Well, I think it's interesting because the AI-powered everything will continue to evolve. And I think it's kind of unclear exactly where that'll head. I think obviously right now there's a lot of solutions around recommendations or enhancing sort of the user experience in a streamlined sort of algorithmic method, which I think is cool. And I think that'll still be the case. Ultimately, one of the things that I envision in my experience, in my imagination, rather, not experience, in my imagination, ultimately, when I think about relationships and how things go forward, one of the things that we really stand on is this belief in, sort of like your local business, if you will, your local store, right? Where people go in and your name, I think in the future, as we start to interact with different brands and as AI becomes more robust, rather than dealing with, a website or dealing with a particular portal or multiple portals, it's really having a customized agent, right? An AI agent that's gonna do some of this for you. But the key to that, I think, at a business level, is that AI agent doesn't just represent the transaction. It has to represent the brand in the same way your local shopkeep would. And so the way that I envision it going in the future is really agents that really represent the brand, that become personalized towards me and offers me a sense of a personal sort of concierge for whatever business I'm dealing with.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because, 5 years ago, when we said it's personalized, we meant like your name was on it, right? It would say, Dear Cairo, right? Like, exactly, this is for you. Exactly. But this idea of being relationship based, and some of the power that AI may represent is that it's personalized because it knows you, right? It knows the 3D you and the 3D you of what your problems you have and experiences you have and your experiences so far with that brand. And if, there it becomes, to your analogy, it is a shopkeeper who remembers what you order and knows that Tuesday nights you make tacos. And so now you must want this. 100%. And represents the brand in a way that feels authentic, right? Which is then you have to think about, how do you get the AI to feel authentically you?
Exactly. And that, I think we're still probably quite a few years away from that, but probably not as far as we suspect. But I think that will be the power of it. Because I think even going beyond the, putting someone's name on an email and calling that personalization, what we also did is we had a database, and we grabbed a field that says, you bought this before, now you want this. No, I don't. I don't want that. You know what I mean? Like, you're right. I did buy that before, but I don't want this new thing, because there was no real sense of understanding.
Right. I bought it once as a gift for a baby shower. It does not mean I now have 12 babies. Right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And the promise of AI, I think, is to be able to make, more intuitive understandings and conclusions, and then really be able to serve you. And I think that's what one of the things I really believe that's at the core of relationships, at the core of experience, for customers to feel like they're being served properly, and that's being not just what they're getting is delivered, but how they're being cared for. I think a AI shopkeeper in this example would have to incorporate those to be really valid, or else it'll be a widget or a bot that we'll all ignore, and it'll be super frustrating.
Right. It's the annoying chats that you're like, no, you can't help me right now. I literally just got here. Right?
Exactly.
Yes.
So the technology has to really advance beyond that, where it really has that sense of service.
But man, it is evolving awfully fast. So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
It'll get there.
Absolutely.
One of the other things I find super interesting about your background and your company is that you have worked across both the US and Asian markets, right?
Yep.
And yes. I would love to talk about how you see cultural, geographical differences in the kind of relationships we would build and kind of customer experience design. I would love your perspective on that.
It's a lot.
That's a big question. I know I went out and I was like, so if you could just,
Yeah. Can you sum up the differences between the, oh yeah, done.
If you could just give us the purpose of life on Earth, that would be great.
Exactly. No problem. No, but I think one of the things that's interesting, and I don't want to speak for all Asian markets, because, I've been fortunate enough I've been out in Japan for a long time. I've worked in Korea. I've worked a little bit in Hong Kong. I've worked a little bit in Singapore. So I have some sense of those markets, but I don't want to pretend to be the expert of places that obviously I'm not from.
Fair.
Again, we've worked in the U.S. We worked in Taiwan a little bit. I'm from the U.S. But I think that generally speaking, I would say that Asian service, customer service, attention to service within a real life environment is better than the West. It's a little bit higher level. It's a little bit more intuitive from a cultural standpoint. That it's really important to make sure that people feel great as customers, that they're getting the best possible experience. I think that's less so in the U.S. I think in the U.S. context, it's been more around, we need to get you what you want as efficiently and as fast and get you out the door. More so as a bias, right? I think if you translate that to how platforms and experiences come to life, oddly enough, I think that because for a variety of reasons, most Asian markets haven't been as rich or robust in sort of UX and experience design as it has been in the US. That services, when you look at online, tend to be a lot more functional versus experience-oriented in Asia than they would be in the U.S. In the U.S., or by contrast, like the experiences online are usually a little bit more intricately designed around how do I make this user feel extremely comfortable. And I think there's probably different reasons in terms of platform providers that have emerged and dominated the market in different places that sort of drove that sort of adoption. But I think that I think eventually there'll be more of a convergence, hopefully in both ways, where in Asia there will be a continued evolution and improvement in UX, where there has been rapid improvement, but it hasn't been as historically ingrained. And it'd be great if the US in person had better customer service and greater care around that as a culture. But that may be a bigger ask. I'm not sure.
Well, and it's interesting too, because it was a super unfair question. Tell me all about all these people and pieces. But I think one of the things that, in just hearing that too, is when you're building your experience, understanding that different customers have different desires and expectations around what that experience would look like, right?
100%.
And that should probably be considered in the development of the design, right?
100%. And it's super interesting because I'll use Japan as an example. It's the market, obviously, I'm most familiar with in Asia. Japan, when we were in the U.S., like, you had your PC-based internet, and then you had like mobile internet. But when Apple really came out with the iPhone and the web experience basically through an iPhone was essentially as good or better than what you can get on your PC. So it was always holistic, and Apple was very focused on UX and connecting this whole entire ecosystem. In Japan, at the same exact time, Japan's had they're called Galike or Galike is how we call it in Japan. I can't remember the proper word. Feature phones, where they have all these features, all these amazing functions. Like, we were doing video calling in Japan way before we were doing that here in the U.S. But the UX of it was very function or feature driven, and the web connection, there were 3 different proprietary internets driven by 3 different mobile companies. So if you were developing a solution in Japan, you have to develop 3 different ways. So you develop for function. You're not trying to, you can't create every nuanced difference to create this amazing experience. So I think as a outcome of that, what Japanese consumers expect from a website, how it's organized, the information focus versus the user experience focus is very different. So you can come up with a beautiful user experience from a Western lens, drop that into a Japanese context, and it just looks foreign, and foreign is not necessarily attractive. It just like, that's not from here, and that creates a little gap or disconnect. So, but I think, again, the user experience in Japan is evolving, and I think it is, I don't want to say improving, because that sounds, people, whatever works for people, but right. I think it is adopting more, is being more driven by user principles, right? And what is the experience you want to create versus information. So I think that there is sort of the gap between Japanese design and let's say Western design is narrowing, but I think there is still a different level of acceptance of what people look for.
Yeah, and I think it would be important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so what I was going to say, just to answer your question as directly as possible is that, I think when you're going across markets, the way that we think of experiences, the way that we would design interfaces have to be culturally adopted for whatever market you're in, not only because is it better or worse, because that's almost irrelevant, so that it feels relevant. So it feels like us in that particular market that we're in.
It feels authentic, right? Relationships are built on authentic connection. And if it doesn't feel like it's authentically the brand or authentic to them, then you're going to have a much more friction in trying to build that relationship.
Exactly. It's the authentic to them part that I think is a really important part, because, any business operating in a different market, you want to feel local. You want to feel like we get it. And if you do best practices from Silicon Valley in a place where they don't move that way, it just, even if it's better, it just doesn't feel like us, which is going to be a negative impact on business.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite customer experience story, like either a project that you really learned a lot of, or just one that you're so proud of that you're just like, oh, this one?
Not that I can think of offhand to give you a great quote. I have a lot of customer experience nightmares going through it as a
well, tell us one of those.
As a user, and that sort of sticks with. No, and honestly, that sticks with me a lot more, because I think it really reflects how bad sometimes we are at it, or how inconsistent we are at it. Like sometimes people, you get a great user experience or customer experience on the sales end, horrible on the customer service end, or vice versa, where we don't unify these things. And I think that's really the point of frustration. One of the things that if I could convince the world of one thing about designing experiences, I think one of the things that I personally believe is that you have to accept that holistically as a business, you can't. Because if you're running a big business, you have people in multiple markets, you have people in different points of interactions, in charge of different sort of touch points. I think you need core principles that guide the entire thing, but then you have to give autonomy to people on the front lines in order to make the best decision for those customers there. And I think a lot of times what I see that brands do, which is where I think it becomes nightmarish, where there isn't autonomy and this experience doesn't make any sense here, but maybe it makes sense there. And there's clearly not a sense of agency that's given the different sort of owners of the particular experience in which the customer is interacting. So principles need to unify everything, but there has to be, to some degree, autonomy within those principles to allow the right experience to happen at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can tell when you're talking to someone who's not empowered to do anything but follow X line. And you're like, but that's not the line I'm asking about. And there's no peace. But you also make the point, and this is maybe the good and bad of customer experience to some extent, not always, but many of the best experiences are that way because you didn't notice them, right? It was just seamless. So I think that is one of the reasons that the poor experiences stick out, because that's where the friction, that's where you recognize that there is a process built in here. Now, there's exceptions. There's things that are so scrumptious that it pops out to you. But for the most part, a wonderful experience, if it just feels natural. So you almost don't realize that it was intentionally structured or created.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about a ton of different things today. If you were going to get listeners to do 2 things differently tomorrow based on what we talked about today, what would that be?
Well, I think 2 things. One of them I might have just said in terms of I think you have to design experiences with flexibility. You have to have core principles and enable agency along the way in order for it to be dynamic, for it to be authentic, in order for it to actually serve the actual needs of the user. The other thing that I would probably do, it's so many, let me just think about it. I think there's a big piece of measurement, as we talked about earlier, that's really important, because I think it truly what gets measured gets managed. What doesn't get measured doesn't, right? And I think part of the issue that we have with experiences and with relationship sort of driven engagements is that We don't know how to measure them, or we don't have ways to measure them, or the measurement's not quick enough. Therefore, we think it works, but let's not focus on it. Without a measurement framework that allows you to go like, well, am I getting back the money that I should? Then you're missing out. So I guess the second thing I would really encourage is really having a measurement system that says, well, how do you know your experiences are working? Do you have those right objectives? And the third, I know you only asked for two, but I'll go back to something I said at the very beginning. It really goes back to the point of understanding problems in drivers. Like before you do anything, before you try to solve something, do you understand clearly what the core problem is in the core driver? And I'm not suggesting that people don't understand their problems, but I think all problems need to be challenged. All problems need to be interrogated to make sure that you've thought about it from all angles. We all have an intuitive sense of what's wrong, but taking time to challenge that and to understand the underlying drivers will make sure that you get a much better solution in the end.
Absolutely. All right. It was really lovely to have you on the show, Cairo. If people wanted to learn more about you or Relativ, where should I send them?
Well, they can come to our website. It's Relativ, RELATIV, no E. .com, RELATIV.com. And from there you can find all our links for whether it's to LinkedIn or to Instagram or wherever you want to reach out for more information. We're always listening, always honestly eager to just talk and brainstorm. One of the things we love is problems. Like we may not always have the answer, but always happy to talk about problems and see if we can offer any value.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate the time. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. All right. That does it for today's episode, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.